In today's episode, we will return to the cargo harbor. It is another major industrial area of the city, so we will expand it with modern factories, as well as fill the empty spots in older places that got damaged during the war. Let's also build a large bus station for workers and revisit some gameplay stuff like cargo deliveries from outside of the map. And since we are doing a project loosely related to water, let's talk about rivers, waterways, dams, weirs, canals, and cargo transport by ships in the Central European region of the Eastern Bloc. Similar to trains, the region was already rich in various natural or man-made waterways after the Second World War, and cargo transport through rivers had long history going all the way back into medieval ages. Railways in the 19th century took cargo away from rivers, but not entirely, and ships still played an important role for cargo transport throughout 20th century, mostly for cargo such as sand, gravel, ores, oil, or coal. Later even goods, containers, and occasional heavy machinery. All kinds of water-related projects were built in the 20th century related to increasing the capacity of waterways or increasing their accessibility, and of course, power generation, water retention, and flood protection. Transport of cargo and power generation tied to the overall focus of the communist countries on heavy industry. Overall, the conditions for these water projects were almost ideal in these countries, especially in the 1950s and also 1960s. Acquiring land for such projects was simple, as it was already nationalized or could be easily taken away. Funding was also simpler, as the centralized economy could mark these projects as strategic and shift money to them, at least until they ran out. And environmental protection was practically non-existent. So when it comes to dams, there were plenty of projects done around the region, but of course their size and power generation capacity depended on the terrain and river conditions. This means that the most powerful conventional large water reservoir dams were built in valleys of today's Czechia, on rivers where cargo transport would not be even considered, even though they were historically used for example, transporting logs. Poland is mostly flat, so not many opportunities there, except the southern regions, but overall there are only a handful of conventional dams in the whole country. But in Poland, we can find many run-of-the-river hydroelectric plants, which means the dam is short, it can be just a small weir, and there is little to no water retention above it, so the river just flows through the plant, which continuously makes power. There are quite a few of those in Poland, built in the second half of the 20th century. These structures usually also allow the construction of locks, so ships can go through, unlike the tall conventional dams. Hungary is geographically in even worse situation for such projects, and hydroelectricity plays a tiny role, with the largest dam having just 28 megawatts of installed power. East Germany is interesting. The larger hydroelectric projects post-1945 are almost exclusively pumped storage types, with actually the most powerful one of the whole region with over a gigawatt of power. Otherwise, East Germany's geography is not suited for the classic style dams, but we also don't see many other water projects from this time period there relative to the other countries. Poland also built a significant pump storage power capacity, which even drastically overshadows the capacity of the other hydroelectric projects. A couple of pumped storage projects were also built in Czechoslovakia, where they nowadays have comparable installed power as the other types. Hungary doesn't have any. The pumped storage plants can also be seen in two different kinds. The one where the upper reservoir is disconnected from a river, so that's probably what you are familiar with, but there are also projects with two dams nearby with the reservoirs on the same river. So the pumping operation basically reverses the river flow between the two dams, although the lower one still lets water through during pumping up. By the way, I'm showing in these pictures the installed power, but just to put it into perspective, the most powerful hydroelectric plant in China, the Three Gorges Dam, has capacity of over 20,000 megawatts, with the other larger dams around the world above 10,000 megawatts. So all of these that we can find in Central Europe are tiny, and so is their contribution to the overall energy production, although it's not totally negligible, except Hungary, I suppose. And of course, the pumped storage types have a different purpose in the whole system. So that was mainly power generation purpose. Now, what about projects related to cargo transport? This included mostly weirs to provide deeper water together with locks so ships can go through them. So here we need to look at the important waterways of the region. The most important rivers were Elbe, Danube, Oder, and Vistula. The Elbe River originates in Czechia, and it is the most important connection for today's Czechia as well. It was an important waterway for hundreds of years, so there were already many weirs and locks even before the war. After the war, work continued to build even better conditions for higher capacity, bigger ships, and navigability throughout the year. There are in total 25 weirs with locks on the Czech side, but it is still not enough to maintain good conditions, especially around the area where it leaves the country. There is then only a single weir with locks in Germany just before Hamburg and the North Sea, so that alone tells you the terrain conditions. Elbe also crossed the Iron Curtain in Germany between the east and west, but that was not a problem for cargo transport since waterways were legally, internationally protected to be free and could be used by anyone. And on top of that, Czechoslovakia signed an international treaty in 1929 to rent part of the Hamburg port for 100 years, so Elbe could have been used for more or less free cargo transport, import and export. Elbe, along most of its navigable length, is a Class 5A waterway, which means it allows fairly big ships of up to 3,000 tons to pass through. In Germany, Elbe is connected to various other smaller waterways and canals that allow connections, for example, towards Berlin and the Oder River. Speaking of the Oder, it also originates in Czechia, but starts to be navigable in Poland in a canal in Gliwice. Relatively nearby, the Vistula River also starts to be navigable. Both of these waterways then diverge and go around the whole country. Oder passes through Wrocław and reaches the German border at Eisenhüttenstadt. Remember that name? I already mentioned it when we were talking about socialist realism, as this city was one of the cities founded after the war as an ideal socialist industrial city. So it's kind of a small world, isn't it? Anyway, here the Oder connects to a canal leading further towards Berlin from the other side. Up to this point, the Oder is only a Class 3 waterway, so 1,000-ton ships max. After this point, all the way to the Baltic Sea, it's a Class 4, so 1,500 tons. On the other side of Poland, the Vistula goes towards Warsaw, where it connects with a network going inside the Soviet Union all the way to the Dnieper River. And just a fun fact, it connects to the Dnieper at Chernobyl through the Pripyat River. Vistula then continues to Gdańsk and the Baltic Sea, while being just Class 1 and later 2, so 400 to 650 ton ships respectively. Vistula also passes through Kraków and the nearby, again already mentioned district of Nová Huta and its huge steel factory. Here on this map we can see Nová Huta and this little canal built probably in the 1950s together with the steel factory. Despite the lower allowed tonnage, the waterways in Poland were quite important as they originated in the coal regions of the south and went around a lot of major cities and industrial areas. Poland had by far the longest waterway network, which was also partially constructed long before the war, some canal projects being even from the 18th century. Poland being quite flat means not that many locks and weirs are needed, but there were still quite a few, especially on the upper parts of the Oder, Vistula, and several other canals and smaller rivers that I'm not even showing here. Finding some statistics for transported cargo was not easy, and I only found a mention that on the Oder River alone, there were 14 million tons of cargo transported yearly in the 1970s. So let's do some math to put it into perspective. If the Oder allows 1,000-ton ships max, then that is 14,000 ships, that is 38 ships daily, and that assumes every ship to be the largest and completely full. Of course, not every single one went along the whole waterway, which is quite long, but still, that's quite a lot of traffic if you consider the speeds and time it takes to travel through the locks and so on. And finally, we look at the Danube River, which starts to interest us as it leaves Austria, where it crossed the Iron Curtain into Czechoslovakia and right into Bratislava. Here, the Danube is already a huge river, being Class 6C waterway for ships up to 18,000 tons. In Bratislava, there is the harbor, and its old part, at least, served as the main inspiration for the harbor I'm building here in the game. Bratislava harbor is very important, and was very important back in the day as well. It was the gateway into the whole Czechoslovakia from the southern and eastern side. The harbor was already old after the war, but continued to be expanded in the 70s and 80s to also include a shipyard. It was mostly used for imports, for example iron ore from the Soviet Union. Danube continues towards Hungary, but before it completely crosses the border, we must talk about the largest water project of the region there, which is the Gabčíkovo-Nagymaros waterworks. It was a huge project between Czechoslovakia, later just Slovakia, and Hungary. It was supposed to be a power generation, flood protection, and navigability upgrade project. It started to be designed in the 1970s, but was finished, quotation marks, in the 90s. Quotation marks because it was not finished in its original scale. It was finished on the Slovakian side with some changes, with 2 dams, the main one, Gabčíkovo, having an installed power of 720 megawatts, although apparently only able to use half, since the other dams were never finished further downstream. But it still makes it one of the most powerful conventional hydroelectric plants of the region. It's not particularly tall, but Danube's massive water flow makes up for it. The Nagymaros Dam was supposed to be built in Hungary downstream, also with very high power output, but the project was cancelled, partially due to both countries' financial struggles, but also because of significant environmental protests in the end of 1980s in Hungary, which were part of the general anti-regime protests of the time. Czechoslovakia also saw environmental protests against the project, actually the first officially allowed protests in the country. This illustrates the important topic of environmental protection and its suppression and overall downplaying by the ruling regimes. But by the end of 1980s, the regimes couldn't hold the public pressure any longer. I would like to focus on the topic of environment in a special video, though, as not only it's an important one on its own, but also from a historical point of view, how it tied to the political developments. This example also partially illustrates that several smaller or larger projects were never built, for example the infamous Danube-Oder-Elbe canal. Below this area, so in the whole Hungary, Danube is then class 7 waterway for up to 27,000-ton ships. Although it goes through Budapest as the only major city, unlike the waterways in Poland, but it goes next to a small, but once again, city that we have heard before, the Dunajváros, so yet another one from the list of newly built socialist cities of the 1950s. Perhaps it's not a coincidence that we have seen these today, as the proximity to an important waterway was quite important for the heavy industries next to them. Danube then continues into Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, and finally into the Black Sea, where ships usually continued to the Soviet Union or down towards Suez and Asia. Although Hungary has one more quite significant waterway, which is the Tisza River, with some weirs and dams built after the Second World War, for example that most powerful hydroelectric plant that we have seen earlier. The Tisza then flows into Danube in Serbia. Unlike other waterways, Danube is used more and more throughout the 20th century, and even today it remains one of the vital cargo hubs of the entire region. So that's about it for the waterways and hydroelectric projects. Now, what about industry? We have already seen several newly built industrial areas in those new 1950s socialist cities. But industry that wanted to make use of the waterways was either already present or being built anew in other existing cities. Not always right next to the harbors, even though that is also seen, but always connected with a railway towards the harbor. A harbor doesn't need to serve the industrial zone right next to it, of course, but act as a hub as well. Now, let's see what I'm building in the game. So right now in the time-lapse, I'm doing the bus station. So let's first talk about that so we can see what I'm doing. And then later I'm going to talk about the port and the industrial area. So we already built a few bus terminals in the entire city. And with each one of those, I used slightly different techniques because I was just trying new things, learning along the way. And this is kind of the latest technique. So let's explain it. So what's different about it? It also uses the curbless roads like all the rest of the bus stations stations in the city, the big ones at least, because they are just absolutely perfect for this particular purpose. You can use the ones that don't have the curbs only on one side or on both sides, and basically create this like an asphalted pit area where you are just going to do all these curbs and platforms manually. So that's the technique that I used in that previous station in that industrial zone on the other side of the city. But what's different about this one is over here I'm not using the terraforming networks to bring the terrain down to the asphalt level, preferably even below it, but instead I'm just using the clipping surfaces. Yeah, you could have seen that I was placing them there, and I just, saw the void below the map because of that. So it completely got rid of all the terrain features and only left the asphalt of the networks, and the rest of the gaps I just filled with the ploppable asphalt. So right now we just have this like an asphalt basin over here, and doing all these details completely manually. So on one hand, it's kind of like a lot of work, but on the other hand, and this is probably just, normal for these kinds of things, the more work you put in, the more customizability you can achieve, right? That's nothing new, but I suppose that with bus stations, if you, for example, saw the bus stations that I was doing in Aurelia, I was not exactly sure how to do them, and it would be a lot of work to do them exactly like this. But now we have certain tools like the curbless networks, for example, curbless roads, that are allowing these kinds of projects to be much easier. Now, also, another major difference for this particular project is that I'm not even bothering creating all of the roads to be functional and to have the buses, every single road open for them, right? So I already know that I'm going to have at least 2 lines go into this station. Obviously, this station is built for many more lines, maybe for like intercity buses as well, for some kind of, other cities, other like suburbs maybe, or something like that. But I don't have those in the city. I'm only going to be running basically like one functional line and another like cosmetic line, just so there is something moving, yeah? So I already know that certain parts of the station are not going to be used. So I'm not even bothering connecting those to the network and making it, looking good and connected. So only the platforms that are actually going to be used, I am connecting them with just one-way streets and just randomly going through that asphalt basin area, so that these kinds of lanes are just going to naturally allow the buses to just move around the place, yeah? So that's one of the benefits of doing it like this. So you can just freely create these connections. You don't need to be bound by the platform positions or just overall the position of the area. It's just literally like one huge asphalt surface, and below it you are painting these, painting quotation marks, these kinds of roads for the buses. So it's actually a very similar principle to, for example, doing plazas, yeah, for pedestrians. You are also doing that if you have like a super large plaza, then you are just going to put the pedestrian paths where you want those pedestrians to go. You don't need to just put it on the outlines only or something like that, yeah? And then those pedestrian paths you make invisible so that only the features of the plaza are visible. So this is exactly the same principle, except it's asphalt, yeah? But otherwise, it's exactly the same. So I suppose that's like the latest technique. I don't really see any possible upgrades for it right now. So that's probably something I'm going to be using in the future if I'm going to build some kind of bus stations in the future. Right, especially the big ones, right? Anyway, so let's talk about the industrial zone now and basically the rest of this area. So like I mentioned in the introduction, this area, this overall area, and especially the port is inspired by the Bratislava port, the old one, the oldest part of it. And that's the shape of the port, yeah, the bay. Now, a couple of those port areas, or the piers, I suppose, those are like direct copies of the real-life situation, even the areas for like unloading the iron ore and coal. But I decided that I'm not really going to continue it exactly the same way as in real life, building more of these bays or something. But we are instead going to use all this open space to just build more and more industry. You can already see in that demand bar down on the UI, on the gameplay side of things, that we really don't need more industry, but I am planning on building a huge amount of housing areas, especially in the 1970s. So that's definitely going to bring that population demand almost zero, I would imagine, and it's probably going to require building more industrial areas. So this is kind of like a preparation for it. Yeah, it's not exactly answering the gameplay demand right now in the game, but yeah, I'm just preparing for some future projects. And to be honest, I'm actually quite surprised. I was really worried that the gameplay is not going to exactly work with my plans for the city, but surprisingly it is working. So we are kind of also gameplay-wise going to make Altengrad functional and you know, balance the amount of industry with the housing. So that's kind of welcome, I suppose. I won't really need to do any kind of you know, weird things to make the city at least somewhat functional. So this is also going to improve all the traffic around the city. I mean, improve like visually, yeah. So there is going to be traffic on the main roads where I want them, yeah. And of course, people are going to be using all the public transport. Hopefully, people are going to start using a bit more the trains. Yeah, I would like to make some kind of like urban train lines later when we are going to build some of those residential areas. But right now, even there is, for example, the possibility to go from that train station that we built 2 episodes back, I believe, all the way to this train station right next to the harbor. So that's a very convenient connection, and I believe that a lot of people are using it at this point already. So that's kind of nice. Okay, so now for the factories. I filled some of those empty spots, actually most of them, if not all of them, in the old harbor, using some more modern looking factory buildings that I used even with that previous big industrial area on the other side of the city. At the start of this time lapse, you could have seen that I prepared like a palette of buildings that I would like to place in this area. So I'm no longer using those brick buildings that are looking very old, even though I am using, for example, those like bigger brick factory buildings, but I'm making them colored white so that it kind of looks like it's concrete, or at the very least some kind of new plaster, so that it really stands out compared to those very old factory buildings. All right. Then we built that new pier with train tracks, of course, and also like a little coal power plant, just probably for the factory, some kind of coal storage place in that area, as you can see over there, and just a couple of tracks to it. But now for the gameplay side of things, for the deliveries of cargo. Before this episode, or before I started building, or actually when I started doing this part right here, I downloaded the Transfer Manager CE mod, which deals with all kinds of things related to just transporting cargo, but even some services and stuff. I basically just use it, or wanted to use it, as a replacement of the old Configure Outside Connections Limits, I believe was the name of that mod. But this one is that as well, and it's also doing some additional features. Yeah, so you can, for example, in real time monitor all the vehicles, how they are just moving on the map, delivering cargo, where, and like fine-tune it. Yeah, the problem with Altengrad is that the city is not in the center of the map. Yeah, it's more like western positioned, so that these kinds of railways that I'm doing right here, they are much closer from the edge of the map together with the roads that are nearby. So I really need to tweak this, make sure that there are some kind of priorities for these different connections, and really make sure that the connections from all around are somewhat balanced. Now, when it comes to railway traffic, this industrial zone that I was briefly showing right there, that was the place with the only cargo stations, yeah, for the trains. And I actually did not even have the railways connected to the edge of the map, because they were literally just cosmetic. I did not really have any need for those. But right now, for example, this particular thing that I was doing there, that's like putting a small cargo station. I believe in the workshop it's called transfer station or something like that. It's just a tiny building and a tiny piece of track. Now, the way that cargo stations work in the game, they don't actually require station tracks. They have just regular pieces of tracks, and together with the building spawn points, you can make it so that when you are going to configure it so that the building spawn points for the cargo train goes on the track, then cargo trains will go there. Yeah, it's not exactly like super consistent. It's a bit glitchy at times. Some train stations don't really work if you distort them too much, but it's kind of worth experimenting with. So that's what I was doing in various parts of the city. So for example, I was doing it at the main station in the city center because of that railway coming from the north. And I'm doing it in the harbor as well. And those are going to be for the railways coming from that western direction. Unfortunately, there is this thing. You cannot really control what types of trains spawn on which tracks. So I have to make all of the main tracks leading into the city electrified because, it's either going to spawn steam, diesel, or electric. I don't control that. So if it's going to spawn electric and it doesn't have wires, then unfortunately it just looks a bit stupid. I was showing that in the time lapse when I was observing that first cargo train coming into the harbor. So now in the city, we have these like strategically hidden cargo stations in the industrial buildings all around. And we have just kind of cargo delivering into the city from the rest of the edges of the map. So that's kind of nice. It's going to improve the traffic. And again, when I say improve, I mean increase it in the places where I do want to have it heavy, so that later we can do some traffic fixes, traffic changes. And overall, it's just busy. The city is just busy. It's alive. And we have these kind of cinematic shots where things are happening. Yeah, it's not just like static decoration, just like in this case, the bus station. I'm really satisfied with this particular bus station project because it's used by a lot of people. We have lots of bus traffic, we have lots of cargo traffic, even some personal cars here and there. So just like with that previous project with the university, this is so satisfying that when I'm building something on the edges of the city, it's immediately going to be used by lots of people. So that's really, really good. You can also tell that there is a cargo train station in this building with like a corrugated metal roof there at the port, because that's where all the trucks are going. So that's very nice. And also the transfer manager mod kind of optimizes the transfer of cargo through the city, so it looks tiny bit more realistic. So that's also very welcome. Right, so the harbor area is very large right now. You can see that all of the empty areas are completely filled, except for that like a causeway, I suppose we can call it, maybe on the side of the harbor dividing the river and the base. But I do have some slightly different plans for that area. I don't want to just overcrowd it with some industrial buildings. I want to keep it open because maybe there's going to be something slightly different in later decades. The rest of the area is now just like an industrial mess. There are these old brick buildings, and then there are these modern buildings, modern factories all around the area. There is this coal power plant, just a small one. I was looking at some various small coal power plants around the region as well, and this kind of felt fitting. By the way, the chimney at that factory is the tallest structure in the city right now. I was actually comparing it with that socialist realism hotel, and the chimney is taller. So that's probably going to be a structure that will remain the tallest in the city for decades, yeah? At least until the 2000s or something. So yeah, the factory is done. It's finally another major industrial area in the city as opposed to that previous one. I think when I was building the train station near that previous industrial area, I was kind of complaining about the lack of industry. Like visually, the city is just lacking some industry. So this place kind of improved that situation. And I suppose that there are some more places around the city where we can do something like that. But mostly this project was just an excuse to really do the introduction about all the waterworks, all the dams and waterways, rivers and stuff, because that was also kind of an important part of just building stuff in the entire region in the second half of the 20th century. Anyway, guys, that is going to be all for today's episode. Thank you for watching. Hope you liked it. If you did, then please do all the things below the video, all the clicking and writing and sharing and subscribing. And if you like this a lot and you want to directly support it, you can become a channel member. Huge thanks to all the channel members that we currently have already. Really appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much. All right, take care. Goodbye.